To Darren Lynn, who is in Houston, Texas, for us. Hello to you, Darren. So tell us what the storm's been like so far. It seems that Houston, where you are, fell just outside the worst of it.
Originally, Houston was one of the areas where the direct hit was supposed to come from Laura, but over 24 to 48 hours before Laura made landfall, it veered about 200 miles east of here to the Texas-Louisiana border. And once it made landfall, that's when the destruction began. 150-mile-an-hour sustained winds ripping off roofs off of houses, smashing windows out of buildings and apartments, and shredding trees, taking down power lines, and causing power loss to more than 500,000 residents there. In addition to the storm surge that you just mentioned, the storm surge came ashore, and in addition to the rains, it's caused a lot of flooding there. So right now, emergency crews are starting to pick through the debris now that the storm has passed and gone north of Louisiana, and that's where the real work begins.
And what about those people who evacuated because of this storm? How are people getting on, especially since social distancing is supposed to be being observed as part of the coronavirus pandemic?
That is the biggest challenge, because normally after a hurricane, the evacuees are put into shelters and convention centers, and they're usually packed. But in this case, social distancing had to be followed. So those convention centers, those shelters were spaced out with the cots to make sure that residents displaced wouldn't be close together because of this COVID-19 pandemic. But as you can imagine, when more than 500,000 residents are displaced from their homes, how do you manage that with so many people and trying to properly social distance? So emergency crews are wearing the proper PPE, their masks and their gloves. And for residents who don't have that, they're being given those masks, gloves, hand sanitizers. But again, a very tricky situation, because there's the thought that if there is a COVID hotspot and people move to an area where people with non-COVID hotspots were, then all of a sudden they're intermingling, and then emergency crews, medical crews, municipality officials, they have to sort through that and make sure that they're keeping the population safe.
And earlier you mentioned the storm surge. The storm itself is no longer as dangerous, but the storm surge could be catastrophic. How bad might it get?
Storm surge is a very tricky situation to explain. Think of it as a large wall of water. In this case, the storm surge that came on the coast of Louisiana was between 9 and 11 feet. So the house behind me, think of the floor to the ceiling. That's about 9 feet. That water went in and rushed through 30 miles inland. So the city of Lake Charles is 30 miles inland. So it won't be 9 feet when it reaches Lake Charles, but that water is now a wall of water. Think of it as a high tide, low tide. So the high tide has moved in, and it's going to take several days for all of that water to go back into the Gulf. Therefore, emergency crews can't get to all the locations where the flooding is. And once they do get there, the next step is recovery. And if people did not heed those evacuation warnings and try to ride out the storm, they could be trapped in their homes. And by the time emergency crews get to them, unfortunately, there could be fatalities.
OK, Darren Lynn in Houston, Texas, many thanks. US President Trump is set to address the Republican